In this video, we are going to explore the complicated relationship between the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung and the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. In a previous video, I showed that Jordan Peterson doesn't understand Nietzsche. Some viewers pointed out that Peterson is just adopting a Jungian critique. But what if I told you that Jung's understanding of Nietzsche was actually worse than Jordan Peterson's? Jung's connection with Nietzsche is a fascinating tale, beginning positively with Nietzsche's writings marking Jung's first profound spiritual experience, but takes a dark turn as Jung fell prey to his own irrational fears. This tension between Jung's love and fear of Nietzsche surfaces in ambivalent remarks, swinging between admiration and overt hostility. Such a reaction seems out of character for Jung, the OG psychologist who once stated that extreme emotion always accompanies a projection. So what happened? Jung's primary criticism of Nietzsche revolves around his belief that Nietzsche was a poor psychologist who conflated his own ego with personifications from the unconscious. In a seminar Jung held on Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Jung mentions certain instances where Nietzsche apparently identified with the figure of Zarathustra. He interprets this as a sign that an archetype had overwhelmed Nietzsche's ego. This is in direct contradiction with Jung's earlier claim that Nietzsche was one of the greatest psychologists that ever lived. Jung attributes Nietzsche's poor understanding of the self to his ignorance of Eastern philosophy. However, scholar Graham Park suggests that Nietzsche's friend, Paul Deussen, a classmate from Schopforta, was a leading expert in Indian philosophy during that period, and they remained friends till the end. This challenges Jung's claim about Nietzsche's ignorance of Eastern philosophy. But Nietzsche's knowledge of Eastern philosophy is irrelevant. The real irony lies in the fact that Nietzsche's perspective on the self aligns closely with Jung's. And yet, throughout the seminar, Jung consistently brings up this point. The alpha and omega of all the trouble with Nietzsche is of course that he is all the time identical with his figures, never separated from them. He has no psychological critique whatsoever, and so he cannot give them their true value. He cannot conceive of a psychological existence that is not himself, not his consciousness. This argument that Nietzsche failed to distinguish between his ego and the self represented by Zarathustra is easily refuted. Nietzsche wrote the initial 4 parts of Zarathustra in a 10-day burst of inspiration. He said in Ecce Homo that Zarathustra appeared to him as a distinct type during his walks near Rapallo. This means that Nietzsche knew Zarathustra to be an independent and autonomous psychological existence. For proof that Nietzsche could conceive of an independent psychological existence, we can look at a section from Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy. The poet is a poet only insofar as he sees himself surrounded by figures who live and act before him and into whose innermost being he sees. If one is able constantly to be viewing a living play and to live surrounded by hosts of spirits, one will be a poet. Jung thought of Nietzsche as more of a poet than a philosopher, and given Nietzsche's own recognition of his poetic nature, it seems unlikely that he would make a remark about poets without applying it to himself. For the reader of Nietzsche, Jung's claim that Nietzsche's psychology is flawed because he couldn't detach his characters from himself and assign them their true value will appear ridiculous. Nietzsche's other problem, according to Jung, is that he fell into the materialistic and rationalistic attitude of his time. This claim is absurd also because Nietzsche might actually be the most outspoken critic of Western materialism and rationalism. According to the Western rationalist tradition, our thoughts are conditioned by the ego, but Nietzsche's claim was that thoughts are autonomous. He even says as much in the first chapter of Beyond Good and Evil, saying, "A thought comes when it wants, and not when I want." But despite Nietzsche being perhaps the greatest critic of materialism and rationalism, Jung is convinced by his own argument, leading him to toss out another misdirected criticism. He says I, the ego consciousness, without clearly examining that concept of the I. He never asks what the I is really. He has no psychological criticism. The moment he began to criticize it psychologically, he would see that the statement I, or the expression ego consciousness, is too limited. It is a mistaken concept. It is wrong. Apparently, what led Nietzsche to view himself as identical to his figures is his uncritical acceptance of the concept of the I. I wonder how Nietzsche could have fallen into such a misconception if he was a psychologist without equal, as Jung said elsewhere. Once again, Jung's claim that Nietzsche fell for egoism is easily refuted. We are buds on a single tree. What do we know about what can become of us from the interests of the tree? Stop feeling oneself as this fantastic ego. Learn gradually to jettison the supposed individual. Discover the errors of the ego. Realize that egoism is an error, but not to be understood as the opposite of altruism. That would be love of other supposed individuals. No, get beyond me and you. Experience cosmically. Nietzsche's claim is that we are all part of the same psychological reality, an idea he borrowed from the American philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson's concept of the oversoul. Nietzsche's claim that we are all buds on a single tree actually foreshadows Jung's own concept of the collective unconscious. We can see clearly that Jung's criticism that Nietzsche fell into the materialist misconception is just as odd as the notion that Nietzsche couldn't distinguish his own ego from the figures from his own unconscious. If Jung had understood the will to power, he would not have made this mistake. Jung seemed to have overlooked the fact that Nietzsche borrowed Schopenhauer's idea of the cosmic will. Jung's mistake lies in interpreting the will to power as a narrow, egoistic drive, rather than understanding it as characterizing the entirety of life's drives. According to Nietzsche, our body and soul are composed of what he calls the drives, sometimes calling them wills to power. They're not just things, but dynamic forces. These forces then blend into the larger drives that define life overall, and these in turn are part of the forces shaping the entire world. Throughout the Zarathustra seminar, Jung keeps ignoring Nietzsche's often repeated claim that we understand life and the world as a whole as will to power and nothing else. Jung's repeated claim that Nietzsche fell into a materialist misconception only proves his lack of understanding about the will to power and Nietzsche's philosophy in general. Take as an illustration this note from 1885. Does this sound anything like materialism to you? This world, a monster of energy, without beginning, without end, a sea of forces flowing and rushing together, eternally changing, eternally flooding back, with tremendous years of recurrence, with an ebb and a flood of its forms. This, my Dionysian world of the eternally self-creating, the eternally self-destroying, this mystery world of the twofold voluptuous delight. This world is the will to power, and nothing besides. And you yourselves are also this will to power and nothing besides. Nietzsche's philosophy is so blatantly anti-materialist that it makes me wonder if Jung's inability to see the obvious has a different explanation beyond mere ignorance. Jung seems committed to making Nietzsche into his own antithesis. Jung's mischaracterization of Nietzsche's philosophy had serious consequences when Jung attempted to analyze the text of Zarathustra. I'm not going to go into everything he said because the point has already been sufficiently made. At best, Jung appears to be a careless reader of Nietzsche. The great irony is that the very places Jung criticized Nietzsche the most is precisely where Nietzsche's ideas foreshadow his own. Jung was no amateur when it came to textual exegesis, and so the idea that he just misunderstood Nietzsche's philosophy is not a satisfying explanation for me personally. There seems to be some grounds for thinking that Jung was possessed by some personification from his own psyche that made him blind to his mistakes. This blindness was responsible for Jung putting himself in the awkward positions of laying preposterous accusations on Nietzsche, without realizing that he was criticizing someone who agreed with him on the very same points. As an admirer of Jung, I wish I could just end this video right here, but unfortunately Jung's statements get worse from here. Jung's initial encounter with Nietzsche was mostly positive. In his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung described his first impressions of Nietzsche. In 1895, Jung attended the same university where Nietzsche held a professorship. Despite the popular gossip surrounding Nietzsche, Jung was initially hesitant to begin reading Nietzsche due to feeling unprepared, but found his curiosity piqued by the gossip circulating about the philosopher. In his autobiography, Jung said, "Nietzsche had been on my program for some time, but I hesitated to begin reading him because I felt I was insufficiently prepared. I was held back also by a secret fear that I might perhaps be like him, at least in regard to the secret which had isolated him from his environment. Perhaps, who knows, he had had inner experiences, insights, which he had unfortunately attempted to talk about, and had found that no one understood him. I feared I might be forced to recognize that I too was another such strange bird." I find Jung's initial impressions of Nietzsche's writings to be quite revealing. At first, Jung apprehensively acknowledges a certain kinship with Nietzsche, labeling him a strange bird. This is due to the shared experience he thought he had with the philosopher regarding the shared secret that had set them apart from society. Like Nietzsche, Jung had undergone numerous mythological fantasies that he chose to keep concealed, possibly out of a fear of being misunderstood, or worse yet, ridiculed, which is something Jung seemed particularly sensitive to. Jung's initial exploration into the realm of fantasy left him with the impression that he embodied two distinct personalities. One was a boy with average talents, while the other took the form of an old man from the 18th century, who was closely linked to nature, the night, and dreams. Over time, Jung came to understand the old man as a representation of the unconscious, which he called his number two. His number one, the schoolboy, represented his conscious ego. Jung believed that there is an interplay between these two figures unfolding in the unconscious of every individual. At the time, Jung was afraid that this condition might be pathological, which may explain his anxiety about being another strange bird. But despite his initial apprehension, he continued to read Nietzsche, and this was a mostly positive experience for him. Some of his statements seemed to me to indicate that he identified quite closely with Nietzsche. Nietzsche was almost like an older brother to Jung. By this time, Nietzsche was quite famous. He had written many famous books, and had all these incredible talents, which may have seemed like more than the young Carl Jung could ever hope for, and perhaps wished to emulate. Of course, Nietzsche was a professor, had written whole long books, and so had attained unimaginable heights, but like me, he was a clergyman's son. He spoke a polished High German, knew Latin and Greek, possibly French, Italian, and Spanish as well, whereas the only language I commanded with any certainty was the Waggis Basel dialect. He, possessed of all these splendors, could well afford to be something of an eccentric, but I must not let myself find out how far I might be like him. The ambivalence in Jung's reflections is interesting. While he recognizes similarities between himself and Nietzsche, this is complicated by a sense of fear or dread that arises for Jung. Jung's initial love of Nietzsche is tinged with simultaneous apprehension, as if Jung feared that truly embracing Nietzsche might lead to a similar fate. It's possible that Jung thought he saw other similarities that he didn't mention here. Both were clergymen's sons, who shared a love for solitude and nature. Despite this connection, Jung experiences a negative impression upon reading Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which, considering that this is Nietzsche's most positive text, reveals some projection is taking place. According to Jung, Nietzsche also had these two personalities. For Nietzsche, his number two manifested as the figure Zarathustra, and Jung identified his own number two with Zarathustra. In his autobiography, Jung continues, "In spite of these trepidations, I was curious, and finally resolved to read him. Thoughts Out of Season was the first volume that fell into my hands. I was carried away by enthusiasm, and soon afterward read Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This, like Goethe's Faust, was a tremendous experience for me. Zarathustra was Nietzsche's Faust, his number two, and my number two now corresponded to Zarathustra, though this was rather like comparing a molehill with Mount Blanc. And Zarathustra, there could be no doubt about that, was morbid. Was my number two also morbid? This possibility filled me with a terror which for a long time I refused to admit. In the beginning, Jung experiences a sense of inferiority in comparison to Nietzsche. He grapples with feelings of fear, reverence, and inadequacy upon their initial encounter. Nietzsche looms as a towering figure in Jung's mind, and he feels a profound sense of kinship with Nietzsche, almost like they could have been brothers. Simultaneously, Jung struggled with a deep-seated fear that they might be too alike, perhaps to the point of madness, a condition Jung refers to as morbidity. This fear that they might share the same fate, with respect to Nietzsche's insanity, creates a strong desire in Jung to distance himself from the mad philosopher. Unfortunately, this fear blinds Jung to the numerous ways in which Nietzsche's psychology actually foreshadows his own. It's possible that through repression, Jung unconsciously prevented himself from recognizing additional similarities, and instead, constructing an illusion of stark differences to alleviate any concerns he had about being morbid also. However, Jung would later discover the truth when he analyzed his own fantasy experiences after his split with Freud. In his investigations into his own psyche, he found the same psychic material which is the stuff of psychosis and is found in the insane. This idea that thus spoke Zarathustra and Nietzsche himself were morbid eventually became a central aspect of Jung's later criticism of Nietzsche. It seems Jung was desperately attempting to clarify, perhaps to himself, that it was Nietzsche who was insane, not him. One of Jung's primary critiques of Nietzsche as a person was his detachment from his own instincts. Jung argued that while Nietzsche preached the Übermensch, a man who through obedience to instincts transcends himself, Nietzsche himself lived beyond instincts, leading us to doubt his teachings. We are bound to admit that Nietzsche lived beyond instinct, in the lofty heights of heroic sublimity, until the tension shattered his brain. He talked of yea-saying and lived the nay. His loathing for man, for the human animal that lived by instinct, was too great. Hence his life does not convince us of his teaching. Nietzsche did have some contempt for those who lived solely by instincts, but that is because such a life would reduce us to mere animals. To attain full humanity, he advocated for a disciplined and prolonged process of self-mastery. Once we have some discipline, we can ease the strict regimen and allow our refined instincts, drives, and desires to manifest spontaneously. Jung's comments reveal his oversimplified view of living the life of instinct by interpreting it as meaning impulsivity. According to Jung, Nietzsche failed to channel his eros, the sexual instinct, and as a consequence, he lived dominated by the instinct of self-preservation. Jung then draws a parallel between this instinct and the will to power, despite Nietzsche's explicit statements that the will to power involves a manifestation of life willing to sacrifice itself for the sake of power, rather than merely preserving itself. In the seminar, Jung includes Nietzsche's character and life in his attack on Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Apparently, Nietzsche did not understand the significance of the things he talked about. The ideas boiling up from his unconscious went beyond his control and ability to understand. As Jung says in his autobiography, Nietzsche had discovered his number two only late in life, when he was already past middle age, whereas I had known mine since boyhood. Nietzsche had spoken naively and incautiously about this eraton, this thing not to be named as though it were quite in order. His morbid misunderstanding was that he fearlessly and unsuspectingly let his number two loose upon a world that knew and understood nothing about such things. But he found only educated Philistines. Tragicomically, he was one himself. Like the rest of them, he did not understand himself when he fell headfirst into the unutterable mystery and wanted to sing its praises to the dull, God-forsaken masses. Throughout his life, Jung was often labeled as a mystic, and one might speculate that it was Jung who hopelessly endeavored to convey these mysteries to the dull, God-forsaken masses. Jung had once remarked that Nietzsche was one of the greatest psychologists that ever lived, but now he accused him of having a morbid misunderstanding. According to Jung, Nietzsche fell headlong into the unconscious, intending to sing its praises to the unreceptive masses. Perhaps there is a bit of jealousy in Jung's remarks. In an earlier quote I presented, Jung said that reading Nietzsche was a tremendous experience, and had rightly recognized the correspondence between Zarathustra and Nietzsche's unconscious. Jung initially associated his own number two with Zarathustra, but he later named it Philemon. When asked who this Philemon was in a letter, Jung responded, "Only myself." Despite this early identification, Jung believed that comparing his own number two, Philemon, to Nietzsche's Zarathustra was like comparing a molehill with Mount Blanc. Jung went on to create his own equivalent of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, titled The Red Book. After having read both of these works, I think it's safe to say that comparing these two works is indeed like comparing a molehill to Mount Blanc. Setting aside stylistic differences, the imagery and symbols in Jung's Red Book appear confused, and the work itself lacks any coherent narrative. It seems very appropriate to apply Jung's own criticism here to Jung himself. But Jung goes on to say that it was Nietzsche who suffered from an inferiority complex. Nietzsche was in reality a neurotic, a poor devil who suffered from migraine and a bad digestion, and had such bad eyes that he could read very little and was forced to give up his academic career. All that contributed to the most beautiful inferiority complex you can imagine. Jung takes his irritation a step further, extending his criticism not only to Nietzsche, but also to his readers. Here Jung suggests that some, if not all, of Nietzsche's followers may be neurotic. His insinuation is quite clear. If Nietzsche's psychology isn't at least partially responsible, it could potentially account for the appeal it holds for certain individuals. In his autobiography, Jung writes, "Among my friends and acquaintances, I knew of only two who openly declared themselves adherents of Nietzsche. Both were homosexual. One of them ended by committing suicide. The other ran to seed as a misunderstood genius." I've encountered this criticism that readers of Nietzsche are prone to insanity more than once. It often comes from individuals with an agenda to undermine Nietzsche's credibility and disparage those who engage with his works. Frankly, it's bullshit. There's absolutely no evidence supporting the idea that followers of Nietzsche will go insane, or that Nietzsche's own psychology is to blame if they do. Beyond criticizing Nietzsche and his readers, Jung even introduced a homosexual label into the mix. These two homosexual friends of Jung's, who were Nietzsche adherents, were the primary basis for Jung spreading a rumor that Nietzsche was a homosexual. During Jung's tenure at the university where Nietzsche had his professorship, this rumor circulated that Nietzsche was homosexual, allegedly proven by the unverified claim that he contracted syphilis at a homosexual brothel. Unfortunately, even Freud got entangled in these rumors. In a meeting of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, in which Jung and Freud participated, the question of Nietzsche's supposed homosexuality was discussed. Freud claimed that Nietzsche exhibited a morbid sexuality, leading him to focus on the only object of investigation accessible and close to him as a homosexual, the ego. A later transcript of this meeting revealed that it was Jung who initiated this rumor, according to Deborah Hayden. Scholar Deborah Hayden has since demonstrated that there is no supporting evidence for such speculation. Jung attempted to contrast himself with Nietzsche as one who had more successfully encountered the unconscious and was the better psychologist. "I was not a blank page whirling about in the winds of the spirit, like Nietzsche. Nietzsche had lost the ground under his feet because he possessed nothing more than the inner world of his thoughts, which incidentally possessed him more than it. He was uprooted and hovered above the earth, and therefore he succumbed to exaggeration and irreality. For me, such irreality was the quintessence of horror, for I aimed after all at this world and this life." Jung's suggestion that Nietzsche's isolation contributed to his insanity may hold some truth, but the assertion that Nietzsche desired to hover, meaning to withdraw from this life and world, will seem absurd for any knowing reader of Nietzsche. Nietzsche's focus was on this life and world, and he adamantly rejected all metaphysical comforts. The notion that Nietzsche was completely unaware of his circumstances is also absurd. In his letters, he consciously expressed his decision to distance himself from human contacts to concentrate on writing his books. He was fully aware that this choice was compromising his health. Despite his doctor's advice to cease writing, Nietzsche chose to persist, fully aware that it might endanger his life. Any valid criticisms Jung had of Nietzsche seemed to get lost in his histrionics. His attacks on both Nietzsche the man and his philosophy often missed their mark, revealing more about Jung and his own psyche. Initially, Jung expresses a brotherly love and admiration for Nietzsche and his work. I think his remarks reveal that his exposure to Nietzsche happened before he was sufficiently mature. Despite planning to read Nietzsche for a while, Jung hesitated, feeling insufficiently prepared. If only he had waited a little longer. Perhaps he could have taken a more objective perspective of the man. I think he could have offered many valuable insights on Nietzsche and the significance of his work. As I organized my notes for the video, it struck me that Jung's break with Nietzsche followed the ancient mythological pattern that is embodied in the story of Cain and Abel. You see, even though Jung is clearly trying to destroy whatever ghostly figment of his own imagination that he has projected onto Nietzsche, he clearly had great affection for him. This tension reflects a tension in his own psyche between his number one and number two personality. In 1938, Jung had this to say about the impact of Nietzsche on him as a boy. Nietzsche's mind was one of the first spiritual influences I experienced. It was all brand new then, and it was the closest thing to me. Jung's encounter with Nietzsche was a defining moment that shaped the course of his entire life. Throughout Jung's work, it's clear that he aspired to reach the same intellectual heights as Nietzsche. He created his own Zarathustra-like figure, Philemon, and composed the Red Book as his version of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Jung's connection with Nietzsche went deep, but was not entirely positive. I believe Jung was not sufficiently mature enough to understand the significance of what was happening to him. Jung seemed incapable of separating himself from Nietzsche as a young man, and this identification led Jung to saddle Nietzsche with accusations that I think are just as applicable to himself. When Jung faced misunderstanding and criticism from all sides, even from his mentor Freud, he should have found solace in Nietzsche, perhaps the only one who might truly have understood him. Jung knew himself to be different from other boys his age. He had thoughts and impressions that he was too afraid to talk about. Perhaps Nietzsche provided the courage for Jung to express his inner experiences, ultimately leading to his break with Freud and the pursuit of his own path. Tragically, Jung's own self-perception had aligned himself with the image of the mad philosopher, and this terrified him. The exact nature of what terrified Jung about Nietzsche we may never know, but it seems clear that it was a projection originating from Jung's own psyche. Jung's ambivalent comments about Nietzsche bring to mind a younger brother who deeply admires his elder sibling, aspiring to emulate him in every respect. But despite this desire to identify with the philosopher, Jung simultaneously feared that he would share his fate, and so he tried to distance himself in any way possible. In Jung's case, his remarks about Nietzsche's character sound like an attempt to assassinate Nietzsche's reputation, intelligence, and philosophical and psychological prowess. Jung labels Nietzsche as a lunatic, devoid of intelligence and self-awareness, afflicted with an inferiority complex. One might ponder whether it's Jung who grapples with the inferiority complex. Jung goes even further and suggests that Nietzsche's brain was rotting away. If you say Nietzsche was just a poor lunatic, that his brain was rotting away and decayed, you are right. That is perfectly true. As Jung gets further into the Zarathustra seminar, his ad hominem attacks get more frequent and vicious as his irritation increases. He is still desperately trying to distance himself from Nietzsche. Many of the criticisms which were directed at Jung by people who did not understand him were redirected towards Nietzsche by Jung. It is awfully curious that Nietzsche, a highly intelligent man, had not a scientific mind. That is the most unspeakably foolish and irritating way in which he screws himself into his madness, an awful fatality. And the fatality does not consist of anything tragic or great. It consists of a lack of intelligence, the lack of a scientific and philosophical attitude. In his attack, Jung becomes so carried away that he says Nietzsche has a lack of intelligence immediately after acknowledging him as a highly intelligent man. The profound irony lies in Jung repeatedly noting in the same seminar that irritation often signals the occurrence of projection. It was amazing to see this phenomenon unfold in the Zarathustra seminar transcripts. Jung explains the link between uncontrolled emotions and projection, only to later declare himself profoundly irritated by Nietzsche's psychological ineptitude. The charge of madness and unscientific tendencies were the very accusations leveled at Jung himself. It's hard to imagine how Jung could have read Nietzsche and not seen that it was precisely his scientific mind that allowed him to accomplish such a massive critique of Western culture. But it may make more sense if one recalls the scientific status of Jung's own psychological theories. In fact, his remarks that Nietzsche was a man who received a sort of revelation, yet in a mind that was clouded, an understanding which was not quite competent, so he was unable to realize the meaning of his own words, may indeed be applied to Jung himself. The profound irony is that Jung's dismissal of Nietzsche's ideas on the basis of his defective personality are precisely where Nietzsche most strongly anticipates Jung's own ideas. It seems like some of Jung's criticism of Nietzsche was projected onto other philosophers as well. There's a great video by the channel The Living Philosophy, which discusses this tension between Jung's number 1 and number 2 personalities, and how this inner conflict influenced his comments on other philosophers. Jung felt the tension between these two personalities played out in his desires. This tension consisted of Jung's desire to pursue science, to study the facts, and on the other hand, he had an interest in the philosophical.
Analysing what Jung had to say about the philosophers, we might say that he has a philosophical point and a psychological one. The psychological one is that they're all nuts, while the philosophical one comes down to the critical threshold between what can be known and what can't be known. For Jung, this question of what can be known is a dividing line between science and philosophy. This tension is a very personal one for Jung, and exploring that tension in Jung's psyche might just reveal why his feelings towards philosophy after Kant are so charged. Understanding this personal element in Jung's psyche reveals an unlived life that is perhaps spilling out in Jung's emotional dismissal.
For me, Nietzsche embodies a successful synthesis of these two seemingly opposite poles. His mind, both scientific and objective, coexisted seamlessly with a poetic and philosophical inclination. Jung, however, levels at philosophers the same accusation he laid upon Nietzsche, who apparently screws himself into his madness. According to Jung, philosophies emerge from neurotic minds venturing into the unknown. Tragicomically, Jung's own body of work is a product of his own neurotic disposition. I can't help but wonder if Jung's harshest criticisms of Nietzsche stem, in part, from a sense of unfulfilled achievement on Jung's part. Nietzsche, unlike Jung, more successfully synthesized the scientific and the philosophical. Nietzsche appeared capable of inhabiting both realms, and the tension between his number 1 and number 2 seems less apparent. In the Living Philosophy's video, James suggests that Jung's shrill remarks about philosophers daring to speak about the unknowable might betray a hint of jealousy. I wonder if what Jung says about Nietzsche reflects an internal struggle with aspirations that Nietzsche realized but remained elusive for Jung himself.
So when we look at these philosophers, in particular Heidegger, who delve deeply into what Jung describes as God's world, a realm he is fatally attracted to and indulges in himself, we may yet see Jung's greatest fears for his own work, that it is all, in fact, a neurotic projection of his own unconscious subjective prejudices. This fear is all the more real when we consider how many people have since thrown this accusation at Jung. But we also see perhaps one of Jung's deeper desires to have what the dilettante always desires: recognition.
Jung's love and contempt for Nietzsche, the vicious attacks on his character, and the admiration of his talents has its equivalent in myth as the story of Cain and Abel. One brother kills the other out of jealousy because he is stuck in his brother's shadow. You see, Jung tried to make his own philosophical offering to the gods, so to speak, as Nietzsche did. But he was not able to achieve the same acclaim that Nietzsche had. Not only does Jung attempt to distance himself from Nietzsche to prove to himself that he wasn't mad, but he also seems to have wanted to be better than Nietzsche. This rivalry between the two men seems to have been, also, a rivalry between Jung's number 1 and number 2 personalities. Whatever the truth may be, I find it truly a tragedy that Jung was so hostile towards Nietzsche when Nietzsche was perhaps the only other person who could have understood him. Jung harbored a love and admiration for Nietzsche, as well as jealousy and contempt. I think of this as a Cain and Abel story, because of the tragic way in which Jung tries to destroy Nietzsche personally. In Jung's great war with himself, the first and greatest casualty was his love for Nietzsche, Jung's brother in spirit, if not in blood. Jung's complicated connection with Nietzsche can be encapsulated beautifully by a quote from Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Loving with great love and with great contempt.